A Struggle and Famous Speech of Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 1, A Humble Beginning. On a cold winter morning in 1809, in a small log cabin in Harton County, Kentucky, a boy was born into humble circumstances. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Life on the frontier was far from easy. Poverty was a constant companion, and survival required relentless hard work. Abraham's parents, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, were both illiterate, but they valued knowledge and instilled in their son the importance of learning, even in a world where survival often took precedence over education. As a child, young Abraham had little access to formal schooling, but he devoured any books he could get his hands on. He read the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, Aesop's Fables, and the life of George Washington. In those pages, he discovered a world beyond the hardships of the frontier and began to nurture dreams of a life larger than what seemed possible. Books, he would later say, are my best friends. Even as a boy, Abraham was known for his honesty and fairness. His friends jokingly called him Honest Abe, a nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life. He was also tall, gangly, and awkward, but with a wit and sense of humor that made him popular among his peers. Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt, he would joke, even as a young man. That humor would serve him well in the challenging years to come. Despite the backbreaking work of the farm, young Abraham's mind wandered to larger questions. He would sit by the fireplace at night, gazing into the flames, pondering what the future held for him and for his country. Little did he know that one day, he would be at the helm of that nation, guiding it through its darkest days. His journey to greatness, however, was just beginning. Chapter 2, The Call to Serve. As Abraham Lincoln grew into a young man, he began to feel the pull of public service. His early jobs included splitting rails for fences and working on a flatboat. Despite the physical labor, Lincoln's mind was always occupied with bigger ideas. He became known in his community as a man who could tell a story like no other, sometimes funny, sometimes poignant, but always insightful. His humor masked a deep understanding of human nature and an unshakable belief in fairness. Lincoln's interest in law and governance led him to pursue a legal career. Without the means to attend formal law school, he taught himself by borrowing books from local attorneys. He would often be found sitting in the corner of a local shop, reading legal tomes by candlelight. In 1836, he passed the bar exam and became a lawyer. His reputation for honesty, fairness, and sharp intellect spread quickly. But Lincoln's ambitions didn't stop at the courtroom. His deep concern for the direction the country was heading led him into politics. He was elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834, where he quickly made a name for himself as a man of principle and a powerful orator. His speeches, filled with moral clarity and wit, won him the admiration of many. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery had taken center stage in American politics. Lincoln, though not an abolitionist, was firmly against the expansion of slavery into new territories. His famous debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858 earned him national recognition. Though he lost the Senate race, his stance against slavery struck a chord with many Americans. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," Lincoln warned, and his words began to resonate with a nation on the brink of civil war. In 1860, with the country deeply divided over the issue of slavery, Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. The road ahead was treacherous, but Lincoln believed that his country was worth fighting for. "If destruction be our lot, "We must ourselves be its author and finisher," he once said. "As a nation of free men, we must live through all time, or die by suicide." Chapter 3: The Civil War begins. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was the final straw for the Southern states, many of which feared that Lincoln's anti-slavery stance would threaten their way of life. In the months following his election, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. Lincoln was thrust into a national crisis that would test his leadership in unimaginable ways. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, marking the beginning of the American Civil War. The war was brutal from the start, with battles like Bull Run and Antietam leaving thousands of soldiers dead or wounded. As the commander-in-chief, Lincoln bore the weight of every decision, every casualty. He was determined to preserve the Union, no matter the cost. Lincoln's early years in the war were marked by frustration. He struggled to find generals who could win decisive victories, and the North was losing battles while public opinion wavered. Still, Lincoln never lost faith in his cause. "My great concern is not whether you have failed, but whether you are content with your failure," he told his generals, pushing them to strive for victory. One of Lincoln's most difficult decisions came in 1862, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Though it didn't immediately free all slaves, it changed the course of the war, turning it into a fight not only to preserve the Union but also to end slavery. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," Lincoln said. The proclamation solidified Lincoln's place as a moral leader, though it also deepened the divisions between North and South. As the war dragged on, Lincoln faced mounting criticism. Some called for peace with the Confederacy, while others criticized his handling of the war. Yet, through it all, Lincoln remained steady, driven by his belief that the Union must be preserved. "I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go," he confided to a close friend. In the darkest moments, Lincoln's faith in his country and his resolve to see it united again never faltered. Chapter 4: Gettysburg and the Turning Point. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had entered its third brutal year. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, was one of the bloodiest battles in American history. With more than 50,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, the battle was a turning point in the war. The Union victory at Gettysburg halted the Confederacy's advance into the North, but the cost was staggering. In November of that same year, President Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen soldiers. The atmosphere was somber, the weight of loss heavy in the air. Lincoln, known for his long speeches, surprised everyone with a brief address that would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. Standing before the gathered crowd, Lincoln spoke for only 2 minutes, but his words would echo through the ages. 77 years ago, he began, invoking the founding of the nation, our fathers brought forth on this continent, a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's Gettysburg address was not just a reflection on the past, it was a call to the future. He spoke of the great task remaining before us and urged the country to honor the dead by continuing the fight for freedom and equality. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, he declared, reaffirming his belief in democracy. The crowd was silent as Lincoln finished speaking. Many didn't realize in the moment that they had just heard one of the greatest speeches in history. But in the days and years that followed, Lincoln's words would resonate with people across the country, becoming a symbol of hope and unity in the darkest of times. Chapter 5: The reaction to the Gettysburg Address. When Lincoln finished delivering the Gettysburg Address, the initial reaction was mixed. Some in the audience, expecting a longer speech, didn't immediately grasp the significance of his words. Edward Everett, the orator who had spoken before Lincoln for over 2 hours, later wrote to the president, saying, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." As the speech was reprinted in newspapers across the country, its profound simplicity and power became clear. Lincoln's words struck at the heart of the American experiment, reminding the nation of its founding principles. The speech gave people hope that, despite the war's devastation, the ideals of liberty and equality would endure. In the North, Lincoln's address was hailed as a masterpiece, a concise summation of the nation's purpose in the war. It inspired soldiers and civilians alike, renewing their commitment to the Union's cause. "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us," Lincoln had said, and many took those words to heart. The president's speech became a rallying cry for the final push toward victory. However, not everyone was moved. In the South, Lincoln's words were seen as yet another reminder of the North's determination to crush the Confederacy. Southern newspapers dismissed the address as little more than propaganda. But even in the South, there were those who recognized the power of Lincoln's message, though they feared what it meant for their way of life. As time passed, the significance of the Gettysburg Address only grew. It became a cornerstone of American political thought, cited by future generations as a defining statement of the nation's values. What Lincoln had accomplished in just 272 words was nothing short of extraordinary. He had given voice to the nation's grief while also offering a vision of hope for the future. Chapter 6: The Final Years of the War. The Gettysburg Address was a defining moment in Lincoln's presidency, but the war continued to ravage the country. Despite the Union's growing momentum, the Confederate Army remained resilient, and peace seemed distant. Lincoln's burden grew heavier as more lives were lost on both sides, but his determination never wavered. The president spent countless nights in his office, poring over maps, consulting with generals, and searching for a way to bring the war to a swift and decisive end. Lincoln's relationship with his generals was complicated. While Ulysses S. Grant had proven himself to be a capable leader, other military leaders had tested Lincoln's patience. Some hesitated, some retreated too quickly, and others outright defied his orders. But Lincoln, always one to find humor in the direst situations, once remarked to a friend, "If General McClellan isn't going to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a while." Through all the hardship, Lincoln remained a steadfast leader, deeply concerned for the lives of the soldiers fighting for the Union. He visited the wounded in hospitals and often exchanged letters with grieving families. He understood the enormous human cost of the conflict, and each loss weighed heavily on his conscience. Yet, he remained committed to the Union's cause and the emancipation of slaves, often reminding the nation, "This war is testing whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure." In 1864, the tides turned in Lincoln's favor. Grant's relentless strategy of total war broke the Confederacy's defenses. The Union captured vital Southern territories, and the Confederate economy crumbled. Lincoln knew the end was in sight, but even as victory approached, he thought ahead to the challenges of reunification and reconciliation. Chapter 7: The war draws to a close. By the spring of 1864, the Union Army had gained significant ground against the Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant's relentless campaigns were pushing Southern forces back, and the war, though still brutal, was nearing its conclusion. Despite mounting pressure to find a peaceful resolution, Lincoln remained adamant that the Union would only accept peace on terms that included the abolition of slavery. "The war must be fought to its end," he declared, "for a house divided cannot stand." As the war dragged on, Lincoln faced re-election. The country was weary of conflict, and many doubted whether Lincoln could win another term. His opponent, General George McClellan, ran on a platform promising peace and reconciliation, and many in the North were tempted by the idea of an end to the bloodshed, even if it meant allowing the Confederacy to secede. But Lincoln, ever the moral compass, refused to back down. His speeches on the campaign trail were a mixture of somber reflection and hopeful determination. "We shall nobly save, or meanly lose, the last best hope of earth," he said, reminding the nation of its responsibility to preserve democracy. His humor, too, was a tool for disarming his critics. "If I were two-faced," he once quipped in response to personal attacks, "would I be wearing this one?" The 1864 election was a close and bitterly fought contest, but in the end, Lincoln emerged victorious, a testament to the people's faith in his leadership and the cause of the Union. His re-election renewed his resolve to end the war and bring about a new era of freedom for all Americans, regardless of race or background. Chapter 8, Lincoln's Vision for a New America. With his re-election, Lincoln set his sights on the future. Though the war was still raging, he began to lay the groundwork for Reconstruction, his plan to heal the wounds of a divided nation and bring the Southern states back into the Union. His vision was one of forgiveness and reconciliation, not retribution. He famously declared, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in." Lincoln's speeches during this time were filled with a profound sense of compassion and hope for the country's future. He understood the deep scars left by the war, not just in terms of the physical destruction but the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on the American people. Yet, Lincoln believed in the resilience of the nation and its ability to rebuild stronger than ever before. In January of 1865, Lincoln's greatest legislative achievement came to fruition with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. This monumental step solidified Lincoln's place in history as a champion of freedom and equality. It was a bittersweet victory, however, as the war continued to claim lives on both sides, and the nation's wounds were far from healed. Lincoln's commitment to equality extended beyond the end of slavery. He envisioned a future where African Americans would have full civil rights, including the right to vote. This vision, however, was met with resistance, even among some of Lincoln's allies. Despite the opposition, Lincoln's moral conviction never wavered. "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves," he once said, a principle that guided his presidency from beginning to end. Chapter 9, The End of the Civil War. By April of 1865, the Confederate forces were on the verge of collapse. General Robert E. Lee's army, once the pride of the South, was outnumbered and outgunned. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively bringing an end to the Civil War. The news of the surrender spread quickly, and celebrations erupted across the North. The long, bloody conflict was finally over, and the Union had been preserved. Lincoln, however, did not celebrate. Though he was relieved that the war had ended, his thoughts turned to the monumental task of rebuilding the nation. "Now that the war is over, let us show mercy to those who have been vanquished," he told his cabinet. Lincoln's focus was on healing, not vengeance. He wanted the Southern states to be welcomed back into the Union with dignity, and he sought to extend a hand of friendship to former Confederates. Lincoln's last public address, delivered from the White House balcony just days after the end of the war, was a hopeful vision for the future. He spoke of the need to rebuild the South and to ensure that the newly freed slaves would be given full rights as American citizens. His words were filled with optimism for the future of the country, a country no longer divided by war or slavery, but united in its pursuit of freedom and justice for all. But even in these moments of hope, Lincoln's life was under threat. The bitter divisions of the war had not yet healed, and there were those who saw Lincoln not as a hero, but as a tyrant who had destroyed their way of life. One such man, an actor named John Wilkes Booth, was planning an act that would forever alter the course of American history. Chapter 10, The Tragic End. On the night of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. It was a rare moment of relaxation for the president, who had borne the weight of the nation's greatest crisis on his shoulders for 4 long years. As Lincoln sat in the presidential box, watching the comedy unfold on stage, Booth entered the theater, carrying out his deadly plan. At 10:15 p.m., Booth crept into Lincoln's box and fired a single shot into the back of the president's head. Chaos erupted in the theater as Booth leaped to the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis! A thus always to tyrants!" He fled into the night, leaving behind a nation in shock and mourning. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he lay unconscious for hours before succumbing to his injuries the next morning. The nation wept for its fallen leader. In the days that followed, memorial services were held across the country, and millions of Americans mourned the loss of the man who had guided them through their darkest hour. Lincoln's death was a devastating blow to the country, but his legacy as the great emancipator, the preserver of the Union, and the champion of equality would endure. In his death, Lincoln became a martyr for the cause of freedom. His vision for a united and just America lived on, carried forward by those who believed in his ideals. The Gettysburg Address, with its timeless call for a new birth of freedom, became a symbol of the nation's enduring commitment to democracy. And though Lincoln's life was tragically cut short, his impact on the world was immeasurable. His story is one of resilience, courage, and unwavering dedication to the principles of liberty and equality. As Lincoln once said, "In the end, it is not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years." And in his years, Abraham Lincoln had changed the course of history forever.